Imagine surviving an entire world war, every battle, every bombing run, every torpedo, and then, when the fighting is finally over, when peace has been declared and the guns have gone silent, that is when they decide to use you as a nuclear target. That is exactly what happened to the Nagato, the last surviving Japanese battleship. The way it ended is something that has stayed with people for almost 80 years. This is what nobody tells you about what happened after the war. When the Nagato was commissioned in 1920, it was the most powerful battleship in the world. It was the first warship ever built with 16-inch guns, each barrel 60 feet long and capable of hurling a shell over 23 miles. At nearly 740 feet long and displacing close to 47,000 tons, it was an engineering achievement that stunned naval experts worldwide. Japan was so proud of it that they classified its top speed as a state secret for years. But the Nagato wasn't just a symbol of power, it was the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who conceived and planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Yamamoto sat aboard the Nagato in Hiroshima Bay, waiting for news. It was from that same radio room that the coded order to attack had been transmitted to Vice Admiral Nagumo and the strike force steaming toward Hawaii. And it was aboard the Nagato that Yamamoto received the now famous signal, Tora, Tora, Tora. Surprise had been achieved. The attack that changed the course of the war was coordinated from that ship. By the end of the war, the Nagato had become something remarkable for a different reason. It was the only Japanese battleship still afloat. The Yamato, the Musashi, all of them gone. The Nagato had survived the entire Pacific War, including a direct attack by aircraft from 5 American carriers in the summer of 1945. When Japan surrendered, American sailors boarded the Nagato even before the formal surrender ceremony was signed. The US Navy described it as symbolizing the complete surrender of the Japanese fleet. Then they pointed it at Bikini Atoll, Operation Crossroads, the summer of 1946. The United States had just entered the nuclear age and wanted to understand what atomic weapons actually did to warships. They assembled a fleet of surplus and captured vessels in the lagoon at Bikini Atoll, a remote collection of islands in the Marshall Islands, roughly 2,500 miles from Hawaii, and used them as targets. The Nagato was positioned 1,500 meters from ground zero for the first test. An airburst detonation on July 1, 1946. It survived. Wrinkled plating, some doors blown off, paint scorched. A skeleton crew actually boarded it afterward and ran one of its boilers for 36 hours without problems. The Americans were not pleased. Japan's most symbolic warship was sitting there barely scratched. So they moved it closer for the second test. For the Baker test, the Nagato was positioned 870 meters from ground zero. This time the bomb was detonated underwater. A column of radioactive water, over a mile high, erupted from the lagoon and drenched the entire fleet. When the water settled, the Nagato was still floating. Even with mines strapped to her sides, placed specifically to help sink her, she listed just 2 degrees. Once again, the most hated ship in the American fleet had refused to go down. But this time, something was different. The Baker test had not just damaged the ships, it had coated every surface of every ship in radioactive water. The Nagato was so contaminated that nobody could approach within 1,000 yards of her. Sailors tried hosing her down from a distance. Nothing worked. Unable to board and unable to stop the flooding, the Americans could only watch as the list slowly increased over the following days. 3 days after the test, it had reached 8 degrees, then it kept going. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. On the night of July 29, 1946, with no crew, no ceremony, and nobody watching, the most famous warship in Japanese history quietly rolled over and slipped beneath the surface. By morning, the spot where the Nagato had been was empty. The ship came to rest upside down, about 52 meters below the surface of Bikini Lagoon. Now here is where people assume the story ends. But it doesn't, because 52 meters is not that deep. Plenty of wrecks in far worse condition have been salvaged. So why has nobody ever come back for the Nagato? The first reason is the radioactivity. Right after the Baker test, the Nagato was dangerously contaminated. Nobody had been aboard since before the explosion. In the late 1940s, with the nuclear age barely a year old, nobody was rushing to volunteer to find out exactly how contaminated it was. The second reason is the location. Bikini Atoll sits in the middle of the Pacific, roughly 2,500 miles from Hawaii. There is nothing nearby. No port, no ship-breaking yard, no heavy infrastructure. Any salvage operation would need to bring everything across thousands of miles of open ocean. The cost alone would be staggering before a single piece of steel was touched. The third reason is the steel itself, and this one takes a moment to understand. The Nagato was built in 1920, which means its steel predates the nuclear age entirely. Here is why that matters. Every piece of steel manufactured after the first nuclear test in 1945 contains microscopic traces of radioactive particles. They get absorbed into the metal during the smelting process from the atmosphere around it. You cannot remove them. You cannot filter them out. The steel is permanently changed. Pre-war steel has none of that contamination, and that makes it extraordinarily valuable for building sensitive scientific instruments, radiation detectors, medical scanning equipment, and research tools, where even the tiniest amount of background radiation in the shielding material would throw off the measurements. Hospitals and nuclear research facilities have actually recovered hull plates from old warships specifically for this purpose. There is a real and active market for it. Here is the brutal irony of the Nagato. It is built from exactly that kind of pre-war steel that scientists would genuinely want. But the Baker test detonated a nuclear bomb directly underwater and then rained a column of radioactive water back down onto the entire fleet. That water soaked into every surface of the ship. The very test that sank the Nagato also contaminated the steel that might otherwise have justified salvaging it. A feasibility study done by the United States Navy in 1974 for a nearby vessel calculated salvage costs against scrap value and found the numbers did not come close to working. The Nagato is twice the tonnage, sitting deeper, further away, upside down, and with a radioactivity question nobody has ever formally resolved. Nobody ever even bothered to run the numbers for the Nagato because it was obviously never going to make sense. Today, the wreck is one of the most famous technical dive sites in the world. The Marshall Islands opened the lagoon to divers in 1996, and in 2010, UNESCO declared Bikini Atoll a World Heritage Site for its role in the history of the nuclear age. Technical divers who make the journey descend past 4 massive propellers, each over 13 feet across, now pointing upward toward the surface. They can swim the entire length of the upturned hull. They can enter the bridge, the very radio room where Yamamoto received the signal that the attack on Pearl Harbor had succeeded. The Marshall Islands owns the wreck. They are not going to allow anyone to salvage it. It is their most valuable diving attraction, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a piece of history that belongs to the world. And so the Nagato stays where it is. It was too radioactive to approach right after it sank. It was too remote and too expensive to justify salvaging once the radiation faded. The steel that could have made recovery worth the effort was contaminated by the same test that killed it. And now it is too historically significant to touch. It was the most powerful battleship in the world when it was built. It was the flagship from which the Pearl Harbor attack was coordinated. It was the only Japanese battleship to survive the entire Second World War. It outlasted 2 nuclear bombs, 5 American carriers, and the entire Japanese Navy. In the end, 5 days of slow flooding finally did it. It went out the same way it had lived, quietly and on its own terms.